emphasize, this is not the first time Russia has invaded a former Soviet state. In 2008, Vladimir Putin sent military troops into the Republic of Georgia. That led to a conflict that left hundreds dead. Mikhail Saakashvili is the former president of the Republic of Georgia. He just landed here in New York from Kiev this afternoon. He's been meeting with leaders in Ukraine, speaking to the Ukrainian public. He joins me with former military intelligence officer Colonel Cedric Leighton and military analyst General Spider Marks. All right, great to have all of you with us. But President Saakashvili, let me start with you. You were just in Kiev. You've been there all week. What do you see on the ground? Are you surprised to hear this at all?
No, I'm not surprised. Actually, when in 2008 Georgia was invaded by Moscow, by Russian army, I was warning then. I was warning prior to that invasion that first Georgia will come and then Ukraine will come. That's Putin is following his blueprint all the way through. And actually, coincidentally, it happened both times during or around the time of Olympics. Then it was Beijing Olympics, and now it's Sochi Olympics. And actually, the blueprint is exactly the same as they applied in Georgia. The same scale. This kind of so-called unidentified troops that basically are regular special units of Russian army. We've seen them and we know them very well. We know their handwriting. It is exactly the same thing. And we are talking right now about full-scale, basically full-scale, legally and technically for full-scale military invasion. That's all it is. I mean, they will gradually build it up. It's not even based on some mass-scale local movement, so Putin is not even disguising it anymore. We're talking about in 21st century invasion of 45 million people country as a response to a democratic revolution that got rid of a bloody tyrant that fled to Russia.
And I just as you're speaking, President Saakashvili, this news is just coming in. The House Intelligence Committee Chairman Mike Rogers has just put out a statement that's very significant for people watching around the world tonight. Quote, it appears the Russian military now controls the Crimean Peninsula. This aggression is a threat not only to Ukraine, but to regional peace and stability. Russia's latest action is yet another indicator Vladimir Putin's hegemonic ambitions threaten American interests and allies around the world. But obviously another development there that this is not just a few hundred troops, or if it is, they control now the Crimean Peninsula. Let me bring you in on this, General Marks. What does that mean? Does that change the game here? What does that mean for the United States, where the president has just said today that there will be consequences?
Aaron, the real issue here is that Crimea is a part of the Ukraine. The citizens of Crimea enjoy no additional sovereignty rights beyond what Ukraine would, although the Crimea tends to lend itself in its support and lean in the direction of Russia. That's irrelevant. For sure, right. Well, that's irrelevant in this case because they're citizens of the Ukraine. And so we need to call it what it is, which is an invasion of one sovereign nation of another, irrespective of how Putin has done it, either at a lower level and now with the threat of some additional forces.
Yeah. So, Colonel Leighton, what does this mean, though, for the United States? It says that there's going to be costs and consequences if the Crimean Peninsula, which is part of Ukraine, has now been invaded and is now controlled by Vladimir Putin.
Well, I think that, Aaron, it's going to be a situation where if the United States really wants to stand up to the Russian invasion of the Crimea, then it's going to have to do something, and that could include economic consequences. For example, there could be such a thing as an embargo against Russian oil, against Russian natural gas. That would have significant effects on Europe and would have to be coordinated with NATO. But those are some of the things that we could do short of military force in a case like this. So
as President Saakashvili, how bad could this get? When you were president of Georgia, hundreds of people were killed, tanks came in, troops came in. I mean, is this just the beginning for Ukraine?
I think it's just the beginning. And actually, last time, some people were trying to argue that it's irresponsible behavior of Georgia that provoked it. Well, what would you say this time? I mean, this is a pattern, and Vladimir Putin is following his pattern no matter who does what. And actually, the reality is that, it very much is reminiscent of what happened in the 20th century, very much like, Anschluss of the Sudetenland by then Nazi Germany, and then, of course, the way how a big conflict started in Europe. Now, this time, exactly the way how back in then European powers had responsibility for Poland, the United States, the United Kingdom, and by the way, also Russia, together pledged to guarantee territorial integrity in '94 of Ukraine in 1994. That's when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. So there is a treaty obligation that the Western powers have for this not to happen. Now Russia blatantly violated its own treaty obligations. So basically we are talking, I mean, all the way through, Western powers have been repeating there is no more Cold War. Well, first of all, there was always Cold War for Putin all those time. Now we are really getting to really hot war in Europe. And this is an exceptional circumstances. Right. And when I'm talking about annexation, Russian Duma has just done a draft that makes it easy to integrate other countries' territories into Russia. This is unheard of. We are talking about Europe, 21st century. Somebody is just coming and trying to...
So you think the analogy you just gave is a very powerful one. You're talking about Nazi Germany going into the Sudetenland.
Well, I mean, legally, there is not much of a difference, because this guy, Vladimir Putin, now goes into another big European country, its neighbor, and wants to grab a piece of its territory. And in parallel, Russian Duma is discussing law how to make this territory part of Russia. Now, I mean, this goes beyond anything that people could ever contemplate in this part of the world. And this is really, really serious stuff.
Colonel Leighton, reply to what President Saakashvili is saying, though. And he's saying, look, that there's a treaty, that it's violated. I mean, you know, the parallels here to World War II are pretty powerful. So what does the United States do if there's this treaty? If sit back and say sanctions, is that enough?
Well, it should follow the tenets of the treaty, no doubt. And I agree with President Saakashvili that there are certain treaty obligations that the United States and NATO have when it comes to protecting the integrity of the Ukraine. Notice, though, that the president did not invoke those when he spoke this afternoon at the White House, nor has Secretary of State Kerry. And that indicates to me that the United States is not willing to go that extra mile.
What would you say, Spider? You agree with that? The United States not willing to go that extra mile? And if so, to the parallel that President Saakashvili just gave, what does that mean happens next?
Well, the parallel is very stark, and it makes complete sense. The precedent has been set. The United States clearly will not act alone, nor should it act alone. The initial steps right now should be what can take place now short of military action that would be sufficiently convincing to Putin that he needs to stop what he's doing. We haven't demonstrated that we can do that. We certainly don't have any influence in the region. But we do have friends, we have allies, we have NATO. We have the ability to try to influence and wedge ourselves in there. Right now, the concern is that we have a waning level of influence, and it needs to be reasserted. And it's going to be very, very difficult for the United States to do that alone, nor should it.
All right, well, we're going to hit pause on this. We're going to come back in just a moment with much more of this conversation. Obviously, a significant question for the United States. Former head of the CIA, someone I spoke to about this with a very stark warning. We're going to have that. President Saakashvili will weigh in. I'm back now with the former president of the Republic of Georgia, Mikhail Saakashvili. His country was invaded by Vladimir Putin in 2008, along with our military analyst, retired Major General James Spider Marks, and former military intelligence officer Colonel Cedric Leighton. All right, good to have all of you back with us. President Saakashvili, let me ask you this question. Vladimir Putin, according to House intelligence officials here in the United States, controls the Crimean Peninsula now tonight. What will the Ukraine do about it? You've been in Kiev all week. You've been with opposition leaders. Are they able to fight back? Are they going to resist?
Look, Ukraine is a very, very peaceful country. And these people were really trying to put the whole thing together. They really reached out to Russian speakers in Ukraine. And it's, I mean, the east of Ukraine mostly joined this protest. So there was not even single pretext for Russians to try to do that. I mean, Russia, the whole thing is that they were trying to sell this story to the Westerners that we are there to protect minorities. By the way, exactly when I mentioned Sudetenland, one has to remember that that part of Czechoslovakia was inhabited by ethnic Germans, and Germany came in to so-called protect. Russia invaded my country to protect South Ossetians, Abkhazians, and they also suffered because they also had to leave the territory because there was ethnic cleansing involving also those ethnic groups. So Russia, when using its brutal force, it's exactly always these dictators that do that claim to be there on a humanitarian mission. They always claim to be provoked, but this claim is not valid. Now, Ukrainians, I think they were trying to start, they just brought in new interim government. The whole thing was going very peaceful. I met with all the leaders for the last several days, had long conversations. They had very peaceful intentions just to do reforms, carry out democratic changes, open up Ukraine towards Europe. That's exactly the things Vladimir Putin cannot forgive them. He's going there because if Ukraine goes democratic, normal, European, like open society, then every Russian will ask Vladimir Putin why we cannot have it's the same Russia. He had the same problem with Georgia because Georgia was succeeding in building a democratic society. he had to act on these false pretenses of pretending of protecting some of our people. So Ukraine, unlike Georgia, has considerable army. They have officers' corps.
So they will.
They gave up nuclear weapons, but their officers are very good. And by the way, considerable chunk of officers in Russian army are ethnically Ukrainian. So it's not so clear how Russians can force those people to fight against their own homeland. So the point here is we are really going towards, that's the worst thing to get to the situation where we might get real war between two big European countries like Russia and Ukraine. And by the way, Crimea also is a very important part for the rest of Europe. So. And then when we talk what the Americans can do, look, just very short, I mean, you don't, even if you don't send tanks, but whatever the treaty obligations are, but you can certainly expel Russia from G8. You can certainly send tax inspectors to American banks and international banks where all the Putin's generals and all his corrupt officials around him, including himself. Putin is the most corrupt guy in the world. He controls the biggest amount of cash that anybody had ever controlled. It can all be seized. It's doable. Yanukovych fell the very moment when European Union announced sanctions that his people started to defect him. So don't send tanks at first stage, but at least send tax inspectors to Vladimir Putin's bank's accounts and basically expel him to from G8 for God's sake, and other sanctions should be added because, I heard President saying it will cost him. I've heard this said by also previous administration after Georgia's invasion. Well, did it really cost him? If it had cost him, he wouldn't have done now Ukraine. He is on a rampage, knowing exactly or thinking that he can act without impunity, with impunity.
Colonel Leighton, to what President Saakashvili just said, that there were no repercussions the other time Vladimir Putin did this, I wanted to play with the former chief of the CIA, General Hayden, just said to me. Here is General Hayden.
He's gone into Georgia in August of 2008. He took South Ossetia. He took Abkhazia. He still has them. And importantly here, Aaron, he really wasn't punished for that. I mean, that took place in August of 2008. By January of 2009, we have a new president. And there is no time in the penalty box for Putin with the new president. It's all about reset.
Right, reset, be friends.
Yeah, and so he got to do that and really didn't suffer too many adverse consequences.
Colonel Leighton, is that what is the problem right now? Is the world now suffering from the fact that Vladimir Putin invaded Georgia and South Ossetia and had no consequences?
Absolutely, Aaron, and really the historical analogy can be brought back even further than the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. It can go all the way back to the Rhineland when Hitler invaded the Rhineland in 1936. Same exact things happened, and because there were no consequences for Hitler, the rest is basically, as they say, history. World War II started the way it did, and it became a real imbroglio for all of the Western world. And this could happen again in the Ukraine. I hope it doesn't, but we have a real situation where the Russians are going to look at the excuse of protecting their ethnic minority, their kindred spirits in the Ukraine, in the Crimea especially, and in the eastern part of the country. And that is where they're going to use that excuse, and they're going to try to kowtow, have the Ukrainians kowtow to them when it comes to this kind of a political situation. And it's a very dangerous situation right now.
General Marks, will this become a war? Will that become an appropriate word to use?
I don't think it'll become a war. What we're really seeing is Putin really doesn't care at all what we say or what the international community says. He's very, very much in tune to what we do, what we demonstrate, and there are a number of things, as we've discussed, economic, financial, and diplomatic, that should be the precursors before any type of military action. However, simultaneously, the United States should be in the United Nations, in NATO, and galvanizing an international body that is prepared to take action to isolate and to try to narrow this challenge that we have. But we have to paint it the way it is, which is an invasion of one foreign country into another. Now, the Russians have a really strong case for the Crimea because they have an agreement with the Ukraine. That's where their Black Sea fleet is located.
Right.
Sevastopol is the only warm water port that Russia has. Every other port in Russia right now is covered with ice. So this is extremely important, and they think they have a sphere of influence, and they have certain rights that allows them to act with a certain degree of impunity. They certainly cannot do
well,
that.
I would strongly disagree with that. Sevastopol is a very small chunk of Crimea. What they did, they went over the mountainous ridge and occupied Simferopol, the capital of Crimea, all the way up, and they cut off the whole peninsula from Ukraine. It doesn't look like safeguarding their base in Sevastopol. It's much larger, wider.
No, of course, Mr. President, of course. What I'm suggesting is that Sevastopol is where the Black Sea Fleet is headquartered. It is a warm water port. It is significant. It is extremely important to the Russians, and it has been for the Soviets for years. And this is where they can conduct influence in the region.
And you know
except the people that they brought in, they were not from Sevastopol Black Sea Fleet. These were Russian regular, like special troops brought in from Russia, by military transport. And the other thing, when we are talking
we're in total violent agreement here.
when we talk when military response don't really work, one thing should be known. In Georgia in 2008, in the end, after the reaction was quite late, but Putin was stopped at the entrance of our capital, not only by resistance of Georgians and by huge unity that we showed, but at the international community's outcry. But George Bush sent 6th Fleet. And actually, first ships arrived very fast, and additional planes were put on alert, preparing for no-fly zone over Georgia. And that's what stopped at that moment Vladimir Putin from full takeover of Georgia.
So is that what President Obama's going to have to do?
Well, I'm not. There have been many different options he can consider. I'm not sitting now in Situation Room for sure there, but certainly there should be considered all the options, because when we talk about this is U.S. security interest at stake. If this order in Europe collapses now, the U.S. will be in trouble. The United States is one of the main guarantors and benefactors of this order that exists today in Europe. And if it goes to hell, then certainly American interest would be at great risk.
All right, well, we'll leave it at that. Thank you all very much. We appreciate it. Obviously, a very significant moment right now for the world, for the United States, for Russia, for Ukraine.